Sarah Bennett adjusted the final silk pillow on seat 1A and stepped back, her eyes scanning the area with a meticulous gaze. Every detail in the first-class cabin had to be flawless, and she was confident her supervisor would notice her precision. As the head flight attendant, Sarah took her role seriously. Working for one of the most prestigious airlines in the world was not just a privilege, it was a stepping stone toward her ultimate career goals. As the first-class passengers began boarding, Sarah greeted each one with a polished smile, silently assessing their appearance. Men in tailored suits, women adorned with understated yet undeniably expensive jewelry. These were the kinds of travelers she expected in this exclusive space. Her manner was cordial, but her eyes were always scanning for anything out of place. Then, the Carter family stepped on board. A tall, distinguished-looking man, a poised woman with neatly styled hair, and a young girl holding a hardcover book. Their attire was tasteful but lacked the overt luxury Sarah was accustomed to seeing. Something about them caught her attention, sparking a subtle furrow in her brow. She quickly ran through the passenger list in her mind. First class. Sarah approached with a controlled smile and said, "Good afternoon. May I see your tickets, please?" Michael Carter, the father, looked slightly surprised but handed over the tickets without hesitation. "Of course, here you go," he said. With a polite nod, Sarah examined the tickets, confirming they were indeed valid for first class. Still, a nagging unease lingered. She returned the tickets with a tight smile. "Thank you. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." As the Carter family settled into their seats, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her instincts told her that this situation warranted her attention. Ensuring a seamless first-class experience was her duty, and she was determined to address any discrepancies. Unbeknownst to Sarah, this flight was about to become unforgettable, not just for the Carter family, but for her as well. Sarah watched the Carter family settle into their seats, her unease growing with each passing moment. The father adjusted his daughter's seatbelt, the mother retrieved a tablet from her bag, and the girl immersed herself in her book. Everything about their demeanor was calm and composed, yet Sarah couldn't shake the idea that something didn't belong. To her, maintaining the exclusivity of first class wasn't just protocol, it was essential to the airline's image. Determined to act, she approached their row again, her smile polite but tinged with a thin layer of doubt. "Excuse me," she began, glancing at Michael. "I just need to confirm something. Are you certain these are your assigned seats?" Michael's brow furrowed slightly, though his tone remained composed. "Yes, these are ours," he replied, retrieving the tickets once more. "Is there an issue?" Sarah examined the tickets carefully, even though she had already verified them earlier. The seat numbers and first-class designation were correct, yet her instincts told her otherwise. "It's just unusual." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We typically don't see last-minute bookings in this cabin." Rachel Carter, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned forward slightly. Her voice was firm but calm. "Is there a problem with our tickets, miss?" Sarah hesitated, caught off guard by Rachel's assertiveness. "No, not at all," she said quickly. "I just wanted to ensure everything was in order." Michael glanced at his wife and then back at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Well, I believe you've already checked them," he said. "We'd appreciate it if we could settle in without further interruptions." The subtle but pointed tone in Michael's words left Sarah momentarily speechless. She stepped back, muttering a quick "of course," before retreating to the galley. Though the tickets were valid, her discomfort hadn't disappeared. Instead, it fueled a growing determination to ensure that everything about the Carter family's presence in first class was legitimate. As murmurs began spreading among nearby passengers, Sarah resolved to act decisively. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she was certain of one thing. She would not let anything disrupt the order she worked so hard to maintain. Sarah paced the galley, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The Carter family might have valid tickets, but the nagging voice in her head whispered that they didn't belong in first class. Sarah. prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of this space, and now that sense of order felt compromised. With a deep breath to steady herself, she returned to the cabin, her professional mask firmly in place. The cabin was quiet, the hum of the engines providing a soft backdrop. The Carters were seated comfortably, Michael reading a newspaper, Rachel scrolling through her tablet, and their daughter engrossed in her book. They looked entirely at ease, as if they had every right to be there. That, more than anything, irritated Sarah. How could they remain so unbothered when they clearly didn't fit the profile of her usual first-class passengers? She approached their row with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Clearing her throat, she waited for Michael to look up. He folded his newspaper, his expression calm but wary. "Mr. Carter," Sarah began, her voice polite but firm. "I need to speak with you again about your seats." Michael exchanged a glance with Rachel, who set her tablet down. "We've already confirmed our tickets. Is there another issue?" Sarah clasped her hands in front of her professional demeanor beginning to crack under the weight of her growing frustration. "I'm sorry, but I need to ensure that there hasn't been a mistake. Passengers are occasionally seated incorrectly, and this cabin is reserved for first-class ticket holders only." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her calm composure now tinged with irritation. "Are you implying that we don't have first-class tickets?" "I'm not implying anything," Sarah replied quickly, though her tone betrayed her unease. "I simply need to double-check." Michael's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Fine," he said, pulling out the tickets once again and handing them over. "Here, confirm it as many times as you need." Sarah took the tickets, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned them. They were flawless, exactly as they should be. Yet instead of apologizing and moving on, she felt an inexplicable urge to press further. "Everything appears to be in order," she said finally, her words begrudging. "However, I must ask that you—" "Enough," Rachel interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "This is the second time you've approached us, and frankly, it's becoming offensive. We've done everything you've asked. What exactly are you trying to prove?" The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Other passengers had turned to watch, their eyes darting between Sarah and the Carters. A few murmurs rippled through the space, but no one intervened. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. Her authority felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Desperate to regain control, she said, "If you could kindly follow me to the galley, we can resolve this privately." Michael stood, his full height imposing as he looked down at Sarah. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced the cabin. "We will not be moving anywhere. We have paid for these seats, and we will remain here. If you have further concerns, I suggest you speak with your supervisor." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as the passengers around them exchanged glances. She had been backed into a corner, and there was no dignified way out. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked briskly back to the galley, her heart pounding. As she leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the neatly arranged glasses and napkins, she felt the humiliation settle in. The Carters had not only stood their ground, but had done so with a grace that made her actions seem small and petty. The unease she had felt earlier was now replaced with something far more uncomfortable, the dawning realization that she might have made a serious mistake. The rest of the flight was a blur for Sarah. She avoided the first-class cabin as much as possible, delegating tasks to her team under the guise of being needed elsewhere. Every time she passed by the galley's reflective surface, she caught a glimpse of her own face, tense, flushed, and fraught with guilt. The confrontation with the Carter family replayed in her mind like a broken record. She had acted on an instinct she couldn't quite justify, and now the weight of that decision sat heavily on her chest. As the flight neared its destination, Sarah busied herself with preparations for landing, hoping to bury her unease beneath layers of routine. She ensured all seatbelts were fastened, trays were stowed, and cabin lights adjusted. But even as she moved through the motions, the murmurs from the other passengers in first class lingered like a faint but persistent hum in the background. When the aircraft finally touched down, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was eager to put the entire ordeal behind her, but fate had other plans. As passengers began disembarking, Sarah stationed herself at the exit, forcing a polite smile as each person passed. Most returned her pleasantries with distant nods, their expressions neutral but unreadable. Then came the Carters. Michael and Rachel walked with their daughter between them, their postures calm but commanding. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps an apology, though she hadn't yet decided how to phrase it. But before she could utter a word, Michael stopped in front of her. "Miss Bennett," he began, his tone measured but firm. "I'd like to thank you for your service during this flight. However, I'd also like to suggest that in the future, you consider the impact of your assumptions." Sarah blinked, stunned into silence. Rachel, standing beside him, added, "We're not upset, but it's worth reflecting on why you felt the need to question us multiple times despite us meeting all the criteria." Sarah's throat went dry, and she could only manage a weak nod. The Carters moved past her, but just as they reached the door, Michael turned back and spoke over his shoulder. "Oh, one more thing," he said casually, as if remembering something trivial. "We're the owners of this airline. Thought you'd like to know." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stared at Michael, her mind racing to process what he had just said. The owners? The people she had scrutinized, doubted, and effectively humiliated were the very ones who ran the company she prided herself on serving. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as she watched them disappear into the jet bridge. Whispers erupted among the remaining crew who had overheard the exchange. Sarah felt her knees weaken and reached for the edge of the doorframe to steady herself. The realization was crushing. All her efforts to maintain order and uphold the standards of first class had culminated in the ultimate misstep. She had misjudged the Carters not because of their behavior or appearance, but because of her own ingrained biases. A truth she wasn't ready to confront but couldn't deny any longer. As the crew began cleaning the cabin for the next flight, Sarah lingered near the exit, replaying the encounter over and over. The faces of the Carters haunted her thoughts, not because of their calm dignity, but because of the sharp mirror they had held up to her own flaws. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt truly exposed, and she knew that this wasn't a mistake she could simply move past. It was a lesson she would carry with her, a reminder that even the smallest actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that respect wasn't about upholding rules but about seeing people for who they truly were. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her hotel room staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The words Michael Carter had spoken echoed in her ears over and over. "We're the owners of this airline." Each repetition sent a fresh wave of humiliation through her chest, the sting of her mistake more intense with each passing minute. She replayed every detail of the encounter, the way she had approached them, her dismissive tone, the way her assumptions had shaped her actions, and the more she thought about it, the worse it seemed. At that moment, Sarah knew that her career had shifted irrevocably. Her carefully curated professional image, built over years of service and dedication, had been shattered in the span of minutes. The Carters were not just any passengers. They were the ones who owned the very airline she worked for, the very people she had treated with suspicion and disdain. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her messages, but all she saw were routine notifications from coworkers and airline updates. There were no messages from the supervisor who had been overseeing her shift that day, no emails from HR. For a brief, hopeful moment, she thought maybe the whole ordeal had passed without consequence, but deep down, she knew better. As she sat up in bed, her mind began to process everything she had learned about the Carters. They weren't just wealthy first-class passengers. They were the embodiment of everything Sarah had aspired to. They had built an empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but vision, drive, and a deep understanding of the aviation industry. They weren't just business owners, they were trailblazers, having transformed an entire industry with their ideas and principles. But that wasn't what made Sarah feel the most ashamed. It wasn't the fact that they were wealthy or powerful. It was the realization that she had assumed they didn't belong because they didn't look like the other passengers she had come to expect in first class. Sarah had fallen into the trap of judging others based on appearances, a mistake she had never expected to make. especially not in her line of work. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her hotel room door. She stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat, and opened the door to find her supervisor, a woman named Jessica, standing in the hallway. Jessica was a no-nonsense kind of person, someone who had always been supportive of Sarah's career, but also had no patience for mistakes. "Sarah," Jessica said, her voice serious. "We need to talk." The words sent a wave of dread over Sarah, and she stepped aside to let Jessica enter. Jessica closed the door behind her and immediately looked Sarah in the eye. "I just got off the phone with corporate," Jessica continued, her tone unwavering. "The Carters are upset. You were reported for inappropriate behavior." Sarah's throat tightened, and she nodded. "I know. I made a mistake." Jessica didn't respond immediately, but her expression softened. "Mistake is one way to put it. You've been a great flight attendant, Sarah. You're dedicated, professional, and you know how to handle just about any situation. But this is a whole different level." "I didn't mean for it to happen," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen people like them in first class. They didn't fit the profile, and I jumped to conclusions." Jessica crossed her arms and shook her head, disappointment written all over her face. "And that's the problem, Sarah. You didn't see them. You saw the stereotype. And you let that cloud your judgment. The Carters don't just own this airline. They own you. They own everything you think you know about this business." The weight of Jessica's words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She had thought her role as a flight attendant was to uphold the standards of the airline, to maintain that barrier of perfection between the passengers and the crew. But now she realized it was about far more than that. It was about understanding people, respecting them for who they truly were, not who she assumed they were. "I don't know what to do," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I've worked so hard to get here. I don't want to lose everything because of one mistake." "You won't lose everything," Jessica said firmly, stepping closer. "But you will have to learn from this. This isn't just about what happened today. It's about how you move forward. You need to fix this, Sarah." Sarah nodded, her throat tight as she fought back tears. "How do I fix it?" Jessica paused for a moment, then said, "You go to the Carters, you apologize, and you do it with humility, not because it's required, but because you understand why you were wrong. And you don't just apologize for what you did, you apologize for what you failed to see." The room felt heavier now, the weight of Jessica's words settling in like a heavy fog. Sarah had always prided herself on being perceptive, on understanding the intricacies of human behavior. But now she realized how much she still had to learn. As Jessica left, Sarah stood there, alone with her thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had to make things right. And if that meant facing her own biases head-on, then she would do it, no matter the cost. As she prepared herself to confront the Carters, she realized that her path toward redemption wasn't just about mending the damage done. It was about changing the way she saw the world, one apology at a time. The phone call came early in the morning, just as Sarah was getting out of bed, still caught in the haze of her restless night. Her thoughts were consumed with guilt, the sting of her actions still fresh, even though she had tried to make amends. She had rehearsed her apology 1,000 times in her head, each scenario where she could show the Carters just how deeply she regretted her behavior. But now, standing in the quiet of her room, Sarah had no idea what the next few hours would bring. She answered the phone, her pulse quickening when she saw the caller ID. It was her supervisor, Jessica. "Sarah," Jessica said, her voice tight with professionalism. "I just spoke with corporate, and they've made their decision." Sarah's heart sank, her throat closing up as she braced for the worst. She had been expecting this call, but hearing it out loud made everything feel more real. "Unfortunately, Sarah," Jessica continued, "the Carters have decided to let you go. They don't want someone with your level of judgment working for them. I'm sorry, but this is beyond my control." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under her. She opened her mouth to say something, to plead for a second chance, but no words came. All she could do was nod, even though Jessica couldn't see her. "Please, come by the office to collect your things," Jessica added. "We'll have your final paycheck ready for you. I know this is hard, but you need to take responsibility for your actions." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the room, her thoughts swirling in a fog. The silence was deafening, and for a long moment, she couldn't move. She had made a terrible mistake, and now the consequences were playing out in the most irreversible way possible. As Sarah drove to the office, her mind replayed the events of the past few days. The Carters' faces, the way she had dismissed them, the sudden, crushing realization that she had not only insulted them, but had also jeopardized everything she had worked for. She had never imagined that one act of poor judgment could cost her everything. Arriving at the office, Sarah took a deep breath before entering the building. She felt like an outsider now, as if the very air in the building had changed. Everything that had once been familiar, the hum of conversations, the buzz of phones ringing, now felt cold and unwelcoming. She couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that she had let down not just her colleagues but the airline as a whole. Inside the office, Jessica was waiting for her, standing behind a desk with a somber expression on her face. There was no sympathy in her eyes, no comfort in her tone. Sarah could see the pity, but it wasn't for her, it was for what had become of someone who had once shown promise but had faltered in the most public way possible. "I'll need you to hand over your badge and any company property," Jessica said, her voice clipped. "You'll need to sign some paperwork, and then you can go." The words felt like a slap. Sarah had hoped, foolishly, for some kind of understanding, some chance to explain how sorry she was. But this was business. Cold, unemotional business. As she cleared out her desk, packing away her personal items, Sarah's mind raced with questions. What would she do now? How could she ever rebuild her reputation after this? Was there any way to fix what had been broken? She glanced around at the other employees, most of them keeping their distance, avoiding eye contact. She had been a part of their world for so long, and now, just like that, she was an outsider. When she finished gathering her things, Sarah made her way to the door. She turned to look back one last time, the weight of her failure settling in. There were no words of encouragement, no apologies from Jessica, just the sound of the door closing behind her. As Sarah stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, she felt a chill, not from the weather, but from the harsh reality that had set in. She had been given an opportunity and squandered it. The Carters hadn't just taken away her job, they had taken away her sense of purpose, her identity within the airline, and now she was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. The drive home was a blur. Sarah's thoughts were consumed by regret, and with each passing mile, the weight of the situation grew heavier. She had lost everything in an instant, and now she was forced to confront the reality of what she had done. When she reached her apartment, Sarah sat in her car for a moment, staring at the building, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. She had spent so much of her life working to climb the ranks in the airline industry, and now it felt like all of that had been ripped away, leaving her with nothing but the aftermath of one poor decision. It wasn't just about losing her job. It was about everything she had come to believe in, everything she had assumed about herself and the people around her. She had believed that she was better than the kind of people who made assumptions, but now she realized that she was no different. As Sarah sat in her car, the tears finally came. They weren't just tears of regret or anger. They were tears of realization. She had lost far more than just a job. She had lost her way, and now she had to find it again. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Sarah understood that it wasn't just about regaining what she had lost. It was about becoming someone better, and that, perhaps, was the hardest part of all.